8-year-old boy warns his mother that stepfather locks his teenage sister in the staircase closet for playing hard to get. When the mother finds out what's happening, she immediately calls 911. Lucas Mitchell sat at the gleaming kitchen island, his small fingers carefully coloring the last page of his homework, while keeping one ear tuned to the familiar click of his mother's heels against the hardwood floors upstairs. "Mom, the timer's going off," he called out, watching the digital display on the smart oven blink insistently. The aroma of baked chicken filled the kitchen, mingling with the fresh scent of the flowers Michael had brought home earlier, perfectly arranged roses in a crystal vase that caught the evening light. Rebecca Mitchell hurried down the stairs, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand smoothing down her blazer. At 42, she carried herself with the polished confidence that had made her one of Boston's top luxury real estate agents. "Yes, Mr. Patterson, I completely understand your concerns about the property taxes in that area. I can have those comparisons ready for you first thing tomorrow morning." She deftly silenced the oven with one hand while continuing her conversation, throwing Lucas an apologetic smile. He watched as she expertly managed to extract the roasted chicken without missing a beat in her sales pitch. His mother had mastered the art of multitasking long before Michael entered their lives, but lately, it seemed like she was always trying to juggle just one more thing. "Wonderful. Yes, I'll see you at 10. Have a great evening." Rebecca ended the call and let out a long breath. "Sorry about that, sweetheart. Big client. How's the math homework coming along?" "All done," Lucas announced proudly, holding up his worksheet covered in neat rows of multiplication tables. "Mrs. Wilson said I'm getting really good at my 7 times tables." Rebecca crossed the kitchen to examine his work, her heels echoing against the floor. She smelled like her expensive perfume and success, a scent Lucas had come to associate with open houses and signed contracts. "This looks excellent, Lucas. You're becoming quite the mathematician." The front door opened, and Michael's voice carried through the foyer. "Hello, family." Lucas felt the subtle shift in the air, the way the kitchen suddenly seemed smaller. He watched his mother's face brighten as she moved to greet her husband of 18 months. Michael Blackwood cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. At 45, he looked like he'd stepped out of one of the luxury home magazines that littered Rebecca's office. "Something smells amazing," Michael commented, loosening his tie as he entered the kitchen. He placed his briefcase on the counter, always in the same spot, and gave Rebecca a kiss. "How's my favorite real estate mogul?" "Busy day. The Patterson listing might finally close this week." Rebecca leaned into him, and Lucas noticed how she seemed to relax slightly, as if Michael's presence helped her carry the weight of her hectic life. "Amy should be home from debate club soon. I thought we could all have dinner together tonight." Lucas watched Michael's expression change almost imperceptibly at the mention of Amy. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely noticeable tension in his jaw. Most people wouldn't catch it, but Lucas had become an expert at reading his stepfather's micro-expressions. "Amy texted me earlier," Michael said, his tone carefully neutral. "She mentioned something about staying late to work on her presentation. I told her she needed to be home by 6:30. No exceptions." Rebecca frowned slightly. "She didn't tell me about staying late. I could have picked her up on my way back from the Brookline showing." "You know how teenagers are with communication," Michael chuckled, but there was something in his laugh that made Lucas's stomach tighten. "I'm sure she'll be home soon. Why don't you go freshen up? I'll help Lucas set the table." As Rebecca headed upstairs, Michael turned his attention to Lucas. His smile remained perfectly in place, but his eyes had taken on that focused intensity that Lucas had learned to be wary of. "So, young man, how about you and I have a little chat while we get everything ready?" Lucas nodded, carefully gathering his homework papers. He could feel Michael's eyes following his movements, assessing, calculating. The kitchen suddenly felt colder despite the warmth from the oven. "Your sister?" Michael began, pulling plates from the cabinet with precise movements. "She's been pushing boundaries lately, hasn't she? Staying late at school, being a bit difficult at home." Lucas concentrated on placing the silverware exactly as Michael had taught them. Forks on the left, knives and spoons on the right, everything perfectly aligned. Amy's really busy with debate team, he offered quietly. Michael's voice took on that soft, dangerous quality that made Lucas's hands want to shake. And you've been such a good brother, haven't you? Always watching out for her. Always noticing things. Before Lucas could respond, the front door opened again, and Amy's footsteps echoed in the foyer. Lucas felt rather than saw Michael straighten up, his entire demeanor shifting like a switch had been flipped. "There's our debate champion," Michael called out cheerfully, but Lucas couldn't help noticing how his sister's shoulders tensed at the sound of their stepfather's voice. Amy appeared in the kitchen doorway, 15 and trying to make herself smaller somehow, despite her height. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, her school uniform still pristine after a long day. "Sorry, I'm a little late. The presentation took longer than expected." "No problem at all, sweetheart," Michael responded, his voice warm but his eyes cold. "We were just about to have a family dinner. Perfect timing." Lucas watched as Amy took her usual seat at the table, her movements careful and measured. He remembered when his sister used to burst into rooms, full of energy and stories about her day. That was before Michael, before the new rules, before the quiet house became quiet in all the wrong ways. Rebecca's voice drifted down from upstairs. "Amy, is that you? Come up and tell me about your presentation." As Amy stood to go upstairs, Michael's hand brushed her shoulder, a gesture that might have seemed fatherly to anyone else. But Lucas saw his sister flinch, saw the way Michael's fingers lingered just a moment too long. "We'll have a chat after dinner about time management," Michael said softly, just for Amy to hear. "Can't have you missing family time, can we?" Lucas pretended to be very interested in arranging the napkins, but he caught Amy's quick glance in his direction. A look that carried fear, resignation, and something else. Something that made his chest hurt. The timer for the vegetables chimed, and normal dinner preparations resumed. But Lucas knew better now. He knew that in the quiet house on Maple Grove Drive, normal was just another word for silence. And in that silence, terrible things could happen while the rest of the world smiled and looked away. The first time Lucas found the closet door locked, he thought it was a mistake. The small storage space under the stairs had always been Amy's unofficial study spot, a quiet corner where she could escape the chaos of teenage life. But now, standing in the dimly lit hallway after midnight, his small hand rattling the brass doorknob, he knew something was wrong. "Amy?" he whispered, pressing his ear against the door. The house creaked around him, settling into its nighttime silence. Then he heard it, a muffled sound, barely audible but unmistakably his sister's breathing. "Lucas!" Amy's voice was thick with tears. "Go back to bed, please." He glanced nervously up the stairs, where the master bedroom door remained closed. Their mother was away at a luxury home showing in Cambridge, one of those evening events for wealthy clients who couldn't view properties during regular hours. Michael had insisted on staying home to watch the kids. "Are you okay?" Lucas knelt by the door, his Pokemon pajamas brushing against the hardwood floor. "I can try to find a key." "No." Amy's whisper was sharp with fear. "He'll know if you help. Just go back to bed. I'm fine, I promise." But she wasn't fine. Lucas had been watching his sister disappear piece by piece over the past few months. The Amy who used to blast music while doing her homework, who would spend hours practicing debate speeches in front of her mirror, who taught Lucas how to make the perfect grilled cheese sandwich. That Amy was fading away, replaced by someone who moved through the house like a shadow. "Time check." Michael's voice boomed from upstairs, making Lucas jump. Heavy footsteps approached the landing. "I'm just getting water," Lucas called back, his heart pounding as he hurried toward the kitchen. He could hear Michael descending the stairs, each step measured and deliberate. "Everything all right down here?" Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing his expensive pajamas and that smile that never quite reached his eyes. "It's late for a growing boy to be wandering around." Lucas grabbed a glass from the dishwasher, trying to keep his hand steady. I was thirsty. Michael crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. His grip was gentle but firm, a warning dressed up as affection. You know, son, it's important to be honest with each other. Were you really just getting water? The glass trembled slightly in Lucas's hand. Yes, sir. Michael's fingers tightened imperceptibly. Because I thought I heard you by the storage closet. You know that's off limits after hours. House rules. House rules. Everything was about rules now. Rules about dinner time. Rules about phone usage. Rules about which doors could be opened and when. Rules that seemed to change whenever Michael decided they should. I'm sorry, Lucas mumbled, staring at the floor. I won't do it again. Hey! Michael crouched down, forcing Lucas to meet his gaze. We're just trying to maintain order here. Structure is important for a family. You understand that, don't you? Lucas nodded, fighting the urge to pull away from Michael's touch. His stepfather's eyes were like dark glass, reflective surfaces hiding something cold and dangerous underneath. Good boy. Michael straightened up, adjusting his robe. Now back to bed. And Lucas. He paused at the kitchen doorway. Remember what we talked about. Family matters stay in the family. Lucas waited until Michael's footsteps retreated upstairs before placing the untouched glass of water in the sink. As he passed the closet on his way back to his room, he pressed his palm flat against the door, a silent promise to his sister trapped inside. The next morning, Amy emerged for breakfast looking pale but composed. Their mother, home from her late-night showing, was already on her second cup of coffee, scrolling through emails on her tablet. Big news, Rebecca announced, looking up as Amy slid into her seat. The Cambridge property sold last night. Full asking price. That's wonderful, honey. Michael entered the kitchen, straightening his tie. He placed a kiss on Rebecca's cheek before turning to Amy. Sleep well, sweetheart? Lucas watched his sister's hands clench around her cereal spoon. Yes, thank you. Amy was telling me about a big history test today, Michael continued, pouring himself coffee. Weren't you, Amy? Yes. Amy's voice was barely audible. Chapter 7. Which is why it was so important to get a good night's rest. Michael's tone was pleasant, but Lucas caught the underlying message. Nothing like a quiet house for studying. Rebecca glanced up from her tablet. Everything okay, Amy? You look tired. Before Amy could respond, Michael smoothly interjected. Probably just nervous about the test. You know how seriously she takes her academics. He checked his watch. Speaking of which, we should get moving. I'll drop the kids off on my way to the office. Lucas noticed how Amy's shoulders tensed at this announcement. Usually, they took the bus to school. Oh, that's sweet of you, Rebecca said, gathering her things. I've got back-to-back showings until 3. Amy, will you be okay getting home after debate practice? Actually, Michael cut in. I think Amy should come straight home today. Focus on her studies. Right, Amy? Amy nodded mechanically, her eyes fixed on her bowl. Lucas wanted to scream, to tell his mother everything about the locked closet, about the way Michael's rules kept tightening around them like a noose, about how Amy cried when she thought no one could hear. But he remembered Michael's words from the night before. Family matters stay in the family. And he remembered the other things Michael had said, the quiet threats wrapped in fatherly concern. We wouldn't want anything to happen to your mother's career, would we? All those empty houses she shows. Accidents can happen. The drive to school was silent. In the rearview mirror, Lucas could see Michael watching Amy, his eyes flicking between her and the road. When they pulled up to the middle school entrance, Michael's hand shot out, catching Amy's wrist before she could exit. Remember, he said softly, straight home today, no exceptions. Lucas wanted to stay, to protect his sister somehow, but Amy gave him a small smile, a brave face she put on just for him. Go on, Lucas. Have a good day. As he walked toward the school building, Lucas glanced back to see Michael's car pulling away. Through the back window, he could see Amy sitting perfectly still, her posture rigid with fear. That night, Lucas started his diary. In a brand new notebook hidden inside his favorite Pokemon card binder, he wrote down everything he saw and heard. Someday, he thought, someone would need to know the truth about what happened in the quiet house on Maple Grove Drive. Someday, someone would have to listen. October brought a chill to Waterbury that seemed to seep through the walls of their house. Lucas sat at his desk by the window, watching leaves spiral down from the maple trees that lined their street. His new diary lay open before him, hidden beneath his math textbook, as he carefully documented the day's events in his best handwriting. October 12th, he wrote, Rule number 17. No phone calls after 8 p.m. Rule number 18. Doors must stay open unless sleeping. Rule number 19. All computer use must be in the living room. A soft knock interrupted his writing. Amy stood in his doorway, looking smaller than her 15 years in an oversized sweater. Hey, buddy, what are you working on? Lucas quickly slid the diary under his textbook. Just math stuff. He studied his sister's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes that she tried to hide with makeup. Are you okay? I heard. Shoo. Amy glanced over her shoulder before entering his room. She sat on the edge of his bed, her movements careful, controlled. Listen, Lucas. I need you to do something for me. He nodded eagerly. Lately, their conversations felt like precious secrets, stolen moments between Michael's ever-watching eyes. Amy twisted her hands in her lap. If Mom asks, tell her I've been having trouble sleeping. That's why I'm tired. Can you do that? But that's not true, Lucas protested quietly. It's because, please, Lucas. Amy's voice cracked slightly. It's really important. Before Lucas could respond, Michael's voice carried up the stairs. Amy, your mother's on the phone. She wants to know why your debate coach emailed about missed practices. They both froze. Amy's face went pale. Coming, she called out, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Lucas followed her downstairs, where Michael stood in the living room holding Rebecca's latest iPhone model, a congratulatory gift to herself after closing the Patterson deal. His expression was pleasant, but his eyes held that dangerous gleam. Here she is, Michael said into the phone. Rebecca, sweetheart. I'll let you two talk. He handed the phone to Amy but didn't step away. Hi, Mom, Amy said, her voice artificially bright. Yes, I'm sorry about that. I've been feeling a little under the weather. No, nothing serious. Just having trouble sleeping. Lucas watched Michael's approving nod as Amy spun the lie they just discussed. His stomach churned with the wrongness of it all. Mrs. Parker noticed you weren't at practice either, came Rebecca's voice through the speaker, loud enough for them all to hear. She seemed concerned. Michael's expression darkened at the mention of their neighbor, the retired teacher who lived next door. Mrs. Parker had been watching them more closely lately, her curtains often twitching when they came and went. I'll do better, Mom. I promise. Amy's knuckles were white around the phone. How's the new listing going? The conversation shifted to Rebecca's work, a massive estate in Brookline that could be her biggest sale yet. As Amy listened and made appropriate noises of interest, Michael moved to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. To anyone else, it might have looked like a supportive gesture, but Lucas saw his sister's barely suppressed shudder. After the call ended, Michael's grip tightened. Well handled, he said softly. But we need to talk about Mrs. Parker, don't we? She's becoming quite nosy. She's just being friendly, Amy whispered. She's always been like that. Nevertheless, Michael's smile didn't waver. I think it's best if you avoid her for now. In fact, let's make that rule number 20. No unnecessary interactions with the neighbors. We wouldn't want them getting the wrong idea about our family dynamic, would we? Lucas added that rule to his mental list, knowing he'd write it down later. Each new restriction felt like another brick in the wall Michael was building around them. That evening, while their mother worked late again, Michael called a family meeting in the living room. Lucas sat on the couch next to Amy, both of them watching as Michael paced before them. Your mother's career is at a crucial point, he began, his voice smooth as glass. The Brookline estate could make her the top agent in the region. She doesn't need any distractions. He stopped in front of Amy. So when Mrs. Parker asks questions, what do we say? Everything's fine, Amy recited dully. We're adjusting to the new family structure. And when your teachers express concern about missed assignments, I'm just tired, still getting used to the advanced course load. And if anyone asks about the rules, every family has their own way of doing things, Amy whispered. Lucas felt tears pricking at his eyes. He wanted to scream, to run next door and tell Mrs. Parker everything. But then he remembered the night he'd heard Michael on the phone, discussing Rebecca's open houses, mentioning how dangerous it could be for a woman alone in empty mansions. Lucas, Michael turned his attention to him. Do you understand the importance of these rules? Lucas nodded, not trusting his voice. Good. Michael's smile widened. Because families need structure, boundaries, consequences. Don't they, Amy? Amy's hand found Lucas's, squeezing it gently. Yes, she said. They do. Later that night, Lucas added to his diary, Rule number 21. Never tell anyone about the consequences. He closed the notebook and slid it back into its hiding place, then went to his window. Next door, Mrs. Parker's lights were still on, her silhouette visible through the curtains. Lucas pressed his hand against the cool glass, wondering if she could somehow sense the desperation emanating from their quiet house. In the room next door, he could hear Amy crying softly. But in the quiet house on Maple Grove Drive, some sounds weren't meant to be heard. Some rules weren't meant to be broken. Not yet. Snow fell early that year, dusting Waterbury in white by mid-November. Lucas watched it through the classroom window, his mind drifting from Mrs. Wilson's math lesson to thoughts of home. His notebook lay open before him, but instead of multiplication tables, he'd drawn a small, dark rectangle, the closet door that haunted his dreams. Lucas, Mrs. Wilson's voice broke through his reverie. Would you like to solve this problem for us? He blinked at the board, where numbers swam before his eyes. Before he could respond, the classroom door opened, and Ms. Reeves, the school counselor, stepped in. Sorry to interrupt, she said, her kind face serious. Could I borrow Lucas for a moment? Lucas's heart hammered as he followed Ms. Reeves to her office. The last time he'd been here was after his father left, when the school thought he might need someone to talk to. The room hadn't changed, still filled with colorful posters about feelings and stuffed animals meant to comfort upset children. Have a seat, Lucas. Ms. Reeves gestured to a beanbag chair. I wanted to check in with you. Your teachers have noticed some changes lately. He sank into the chair, trying to make himself smaller. Changes? You seem distracted in class. Mrs. Wilson says you're drawing during lessons instead of taking notes. She leaned forward slightly. And you've been falling asleep during reading time. Lucas stared at his shoes. They were new. Michael had bought them last weekend. Another perfect gift from the perfect stepfather. I'm just tired. Is everything okay at home? Ms. Reeves's voice was gentle. Sometimes when families blend together, it can be difficult to adjust. The question hung in the air like a trap. Lucas thought of Amy, of the rules, of Michael's quiet threats. Everything's fine, he said, the words tasting like lies. Mom's really busy with work, that's all. Ms. Reeves made a note on her pad. And how are things with your stepfather? Michael, right? Lucas's fingers dug into the beanbag. He's nice. He helps us with homework and makes sure we follow the rules. What kind of rules? For a moment, Lucas considered telling her everything. About the closet. About Amy's tears. About the way Michael watched them all the time. Instead, he repeated the practice line. Every family has their own way of doing things. After school, Michael was waiting in the car line instead of letting them take the bus. Lucas's stomach dropped when he saw the familiar black sedan. How was your day? Michael asked as Lucas climbed into the back seat. His tone was pleasant, but his eyes in the rearview mirror were sharp. Anything interesting happen? No, Lucas said quickly. Too quickly. Michael's smile tightened. Really? Because I got an interesting call from the school counselor's office wanting to schedule a parent meeting. Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. She just wanted to check if I was okay, because I was tired in class. I see. Michael pulled away from the curb. And what did you tell her? That everything's fine. That you help us with homework and make sure we follow the rules. Lucas's voice shook slightly. I didn't tell her anything else. Good boy. Michael's voice softened. We wouldn't want people misunderstanding our family situation, would we? Your mother's working so hard on the Brookline estate. It would be a shame if anything disrupted that. They pulled up to the high school to collect Amy. She emerged from the building with her friend Katie, but stopped short when she saw Michael's car. I thought Mom was picking us up, Amy said as she slid into the back seat. Change of plans, Michael replied smoothly. Katie, would you like a ride home? Katie glanced between Amy and Michael, her expression concerned. No thanks. My mom's coming. As they drove away, Lucas caught sight of Katie watching them leave, her phone already in her hand. There was something about her expression that gave him hope, like maybe she saw what nobody else seemed to notice. At home, Michael insisted on a family dinner, despite Rebecca working late again. He watched as Amy pushed food around her plate, his eyes never leaving her. I ran into Mrs. Parker today, he mentioned casually. She asked about you, Amy. Seemed worried about your debate team absence. Amy's fork clattered against her plate. I told her I was focusing on academics this semester. Did you? Michael's voice carried that dangerous edge. Interesting, because she mentioned something about seeing you crying in the backyard yesterday. Lucas saw his sister's face go pale. I was just stressed about exams. Really? Michael stood, moving behind Amy's chair. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, fingers digging in. Because I thought we had a clear understanding about speaking to the neighbors. I didn't, Amy's voice cracked. She saw me through the fence. I didn't talk to her. Nevertheless, Michael's grip tightened. I think you need some quiet time to reflect on the importance of family privacy. Lucas, go to your room. No. The word burst from Lucas before he could stop it. Please, don't. Lucas. Michael's voice was silk over steel. Room. Now. Unless you want to join your sister in reflection time. Amy caught Lucas's eye, giving him a tiny shake of her head. Go, her eyes pleaded. Please go. Lucas stumbled up the stairs, his vision blurring with tears. He heard the familiar sound of the closet door opening, Amy's muffled protest, then the click of the lock. In his room, he pulled out his diary with trembling hands. But instead of writing, he drew. The closet door, again and again, darker and darker, until the page was nearly black with graphite. Outside his window, snow continued to fall, covering their quiet house in a blanket of silence. Next door, Mrs. Parker's lights were on. As Lucas watched, she moved to her window, staring directly at their house. She stood there for a long time, her expression troubled, before finally reaching for her phone. Lucas pressed his hand against the cold glass, wondering if this time, someone would finally hear the whispers in the dark. The Brookline house stood like a fortress against the December sky, its stone facade and wrought iron gates imposing even in the weak winter sunlight. Lucas sat in the back seat of Rebecca's car, watching as his mother adjusted her blazer one final time. It's just a quick showing, she promised, checking her lipstick in the rearview mirror. Michael's meeting has been canceled, so he'll be home early. You two can start your homework in the kitchen until I'm done. Lucas glanced at Amy, who sat rigid beside him, her face carefully blank. Michael being home early had stopped being good news months ago. Mom, he started. But Amy's hand found his, squeezing in warning. Yes, sweetheart. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Nothing. Good luck with the showing. Inside the mansion, their footsteps echoed on marble floors. Rebecca's heels clicked purposefully as she prepared for her clients, switching on lights and adjusting curtains with practiced efficiency. Stay on the first floor, she instructed, checking her phone. The clients will be here in 20 minutes. Amy, make sure Lucas doesn't wander. As soon as Rebecca disappeared upstairs, Amy slumped against a wall, her composure cracking. "I can't go home," she whispered. "Not today. Not after what happened with Katie." Lucas moved closer, understanding flooding through him. Katie, Amy's best friend since 7th grade, had tried to tell their school counselor about the changes she'd noticed in Amy. Michael had found out. He always found out. And his rage had been terrifying, even if he never raised his voice. "Maybe," Lucas hesitated. "Maybe we could tell Mom. Now, while he's not here." Amy shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He'll know. He always knows." And then, she couldn't finish the sentence. A noise from upstairs made them both jump. Amy quickly wiped her face, but not before Lucas saw the bruise she'd been hiding with makeup, a shadow along her jawline from where Michael had gripped her face, forcing her to look at him while he explained exactly what would happen if Katie didn't learn to mind her own business. The sound of car doors closing outside sent them scrambling to look normal. Through the grand windows, they could see Rebecca greeting a well-dressed couple, her professional smile firmly in place. "Lucas," Amy whispered urgently, "promise me something. No matter what happens, don't try to be brave. Don't try to help. Just stay safe." Before he could respond, Rebecca's voice floated through the foyer. "And here we have the grand entrance, with original 19th century millwork." The next few hours passed in a blur. The showing went well, Lucas could tell by his mother's excited phone calls afterward. But all he could focus on was Amy's face, the way she seemed to fold in on herself as they drove home. Michael's car was already in the driveway when they arrived. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm lights of their house, looking every inch the concerned father. "How was the showing?" he asked, kissing Rebecca's cheek as they entered. "Any promising feedback?" "They loved it," Rebecca beamed. "Their agent thinks they might make an offer by Friday." "Wonderful news." Michael's smile didn't reach his eyes as they fixed on Amy. "Amy, sweetheart, why don't you help me in the study? I want to discuss that call I received from Katie's mother." Lucas watched helplessly as Amy followed Michael down the hallway. He heard the study door close, heard the soft murmur of Michael's voice, too quiet to make out the words. Rebecca was already on another call, pacing the kitchen as she discussed counteroffer strategies. Lucas stood in the hallway, his heart pounding, knowing what was coming next. When Michael emerged from the study alone, Lucas felt his world tilt sideways. "Where's Amy?" he asked, even though he knew. He knew. Michael's smile was gentle, reasonable. "Your sister needs some quiet time to think about her choices, about loyalty, about family." He glanced toward the kitchen, where Rebecca was still deep in conversation. "Why don't you go start your homework?" But Lucas couldn't move. All he could think about was Amy's face, her whispered plea, "Don't try to be brave." He waited until Michael went upstairs, until his mother stepped onto the back porch for better reception. Then, moving as quietly as he could, he approached the closet under the stairs. "Amy?" he whispered against the door. No response. "Amy, please." A soft sound, breathing or crying or both. Lucas pressed his hand against the door, feeling the wood grain beneath his fingers. In his other hand, he clutched his phone. The one Michael didn't know about. The one Katie had slipped him at school last week, just in case. "Don't try to be brave," Amy had said. But as he stood there, listening to his sister's muffled sobs, Lucas realized something. Sometimes being brave meant being scared and acting anyway. With trembling fingers, he opened his phone's camera app. He pointed it at the closet door, at the heavy padlock Michael had installed for storage security. Then, gathering every ounce of courage he possessed, he started recording. "My name is Lucas Mitchell," he whispered to the camera. "I'm 8 years old, and I need to tell you what's happening in our quiet house." To be continued. The video was shaky, but clear. Lucas's small hand appeared in frame, touching the padlock, demonstrating how it was secured from the outside. "He locks her in here," his voice whispered, trembling but determined. "When she breaks the rules. When she tries to tell someone." He swallowed hard. "When she makes him angry." A muffled sound came from inside the closet. Lucas, please go. Amy's voice was barely audible. He'll check the cameras soon. Lucas's heart stopped. The cameras. In his determination to document what was happening, he'd forgotten about the security system Michael had installed, supposedly to keep the family safe. How long did he have before Michael noticed him on the feed? But he couldn't stop now. Moving the phone closer to the door, he continued, "This is my sister Amy. She's 15. Our stepfather, Michael Blackwood. Lucas." Michael's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What are you doing?" The phone clattered to the floor as Lucas spun around. Michael stood at the top of the stairs, his expression perfectly calm. Too calm. "I asked you a question, son." Each step down brought him closer, his shoes making no sound on the carpeted stairs. "What are you doing by the storage closet?" Lucas's mind raced. Through the kitchen window, he could see his mother still on the back porch, gesturing animatedly as she negotiated with clients. So close, yet impossibly far away. Lucas's voice failed him as Michael reached the bottom of the stairs. "Is that a phone?" Michael's eyes fixed on the device lying face down on the hardwood floor. "Where did you get that?" Lucas didn't answer. Couldn't answer. His entire body had gone cold with fear. Michael bent down, picking up the phone with deliberate slowness. "You've been recording." It wasn't a question. "Did Katie give this to you?" A small sound escaped from behind the closet door. Amy, trying to warn him, to stop him, to save him. "I won't let you hurt her anymore," Lucas whispered, his voice gaining strength. "I won't let you lock her up and pretend everything's okay." For a long moment, Michael just stared at him. Then his lips curved into that familiar, terrible smile. "Lucas, Lucas, Lucas." He shook his head slowly. "I thought you understood about family loyalty, about keeping our private matters private." He took a step closer. "Do you know what happens to families when outsiders interfere? When children make up stories about their parents?" "They're not stories," Lucas said, his voice shaking but clear. "And you're not my father." Michael's hand shot out, gripping Lucas's arm with bruising force. "No, I'm not. I'm something much more important. I'm the man who keeps this family together, who makes sure your mother's career stays successful, who makes sure terrible accidents don't happen during those late-night showings in empty houses." "Let him go." Amy's voice came through the door, stronger now. "Please, Michael, he's just a kid. I'll be better, I promise. Just let him go." "Shut up." For the first time, Michael's perfect control cracked. His fingers dug deeper into Lucas's arm. "Both of you need to learn. Need to understand the consequences of—" "Michael!" Rebecca's voice drifted in from the kitchen. "Is everything okay? I thought I heard shouting." Lucas saw his chance. Maybe his only chance. Taking a deep breath, he screamed, The closet." He locks Amy in the closet. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Michael's hand released Lucas's arm, only to strike him across the face with enough force to send him stumbling backward. The phone went flying, shattering against the wall. From the kitchen came the sound of running footsteps, Rebecca's voice calling out in confusion and alarm. And then, cutting through it all, came the sound that would haunt Lucas's dreams for years to come. The terrible splintering crack as Amy threw her full weight against the closet door, breaking it partially off its hinges. "Get away from him." Amy's voice was raw, primal. She squeezed through the broken door, placing herself between Lucas and Michael. "Don't you dare touch my brother." Rebecca appeared in the hallway, her face draining of color as she took in the scene. Michael standing with his hands still raised, Lucas crumpled against the wall, Amy half emerging from the splintered closet door with tears streaming down her face. "What?" Rebecca's voice faltered. "What is happening in my house?" Michael's mask slipped back into place, smooth and reasonable. "Rebecca, sweetheart, I can explain. The children have been—" "He locks her in there," Lucas interrupted, his cheek stinging where Michael had struck him. "When she breaks his rules, when she tries to tell anyone, he threatens you, says he'll make something happen during your showings if we don't obey." "Amy!" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Is this true? Amy couldn't speak. She just nodded, her whole body shaking as she maintained her protective stance in front of Lucas. Michael took a step toward Rebecca, his hands raised placatingly. They're confused, upset. You know how children can exaggerate. Don't. Rebecca's voice had turned to steel. Her hand was already pulling out her phone. Don't you dare move. As she dialed 911, Lucas saw something he'd never seen before. Fear in Michael's eyes. Real fear, cracking through the perfect facade like lightning through glass. In that moment, in the quiet house on Maple Grove Drive, silence finally gave way to truth. And truth, Lucas realized, sounded like his mother's voice, steady and clear, telling the emergency operator, I need police at 47 Maple Grove Drive. My husband has been abusing my children. Please hurry. Please. The quiet house would never be quiet in quite the same way again. Blue and red lights painted the quiet house in urgent colors, reflecting off the fresh snow and neighboring windows. Detective Laura Martinez stood in the foyer, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. The splintered closet door, the shattered phone on the floor, the small video camera in her hand. Play it again, she instructed the forensics tech. The screen flickered to life with Lucas's shaky footage. In the living room, Lucas sat curled against his mother on the couch, an ice pack pressed gently to his cheek. Rebecca's arm never left his shoulders, though her whole body trembled. Amy sat on Rebecca's other side, wrapped in a shock blanket, her eyes fixed on the officers photographing the closet. Mrs. Mitchell. Detective Martinez approached them, her manner gentle but professional. We need to document your daughter's injuries. Would you be comfortable accompanying her upstairs with our female officer? Rebecca's face crumpled. Injuries. Amy's hand found her mother's. It's okay, Mom. I can show them. As they stood, Lucas grabbed Amy's other hand. Don't leave. I'll be right back, buddy. Amy's voice was hoarse but steady. Promise. Detective Martinez took their place on the couch, positioning herself at Lucas's eye level. Lucas, you did something very brave tonight. Can you tell me when you started making videos? Just today, he whispered. But I have other proof. Slowly, he pulled his Pokemon binder from behind a couch cushion. I wrote everything down, every rule, every time he locked her up, every threat. The detective accepted the diary carefully, as if handling evidence made of glass. May I? Lucas nodded. He watched as she read his careful documentation, noting how her jaw tightened at certain passages. Lucas, she said finally, did Michael ever hurt you before tonight? Not like Amy. His voice was small. He just watched me all the time, said he'd hurt Mom if we told, said accidents happen in empty houses. A commotion at the front door drew their attention. Mrs. Parker stood there, still in her nightgown under a heavy coat, arguing with an officer. I need to see them, she was saying. I've been watching that man for months. I knew something was wrong. I called CPS twice, but they said without proof. She caught sight of Lucas and her voice broke. Oh, sweetheart. Let her in, Detective Martinez instructed. Mrs. Parker will need your statement. Lucas listened as his neighbor detailed everything she'd observed. Amy's declining health, the late-night sounds, the suspicious injuries. Each word seemed to weigh heavier on Rebecca, who had returned downstairs without Amy. Why didn't you tell me? Rebecca whispered, more to herself than anyone else. I'm their mother. I should have known. Mrs. Mitchell. Detective Martinez's voice was firm but kind. Abusers like Michael are experts at manipulation. They isolate their victims, create fear, make threats seem reasonable. This is not your fault. He's still out there, Lucas said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. Michael. He ran when Mom called 911. What if he comes back? He won't. Detective Martinez's tone left no room for doubt. We have units at every exit from Waterbury. His photo has been distributed to law enforcement across 3 states. And she held up her phone, displaying a news alert. His face is already on every major network. Your video made sure of that. Upstairs, they heard Amy's muffled crying as the medical examiner documented her injuries. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists. I want to understand, she said, her voice shaking. I need to understand how I didn't see. Mrs. Parker moved to sit beside her. You saw what he wanted you to see. We all did. A successful businessman, a caring stepfather, a perfect husband. He made sure you were busy, Lucas added quietly, always calling about work stuff when Amy was in trouble, always having meetings when something bad happened. Detective Martinez nodded. Classic isolation tactics. He manipulated your schedule to maintain control. Those work calls? We'll probably find they came from burner phones. Those client meetings? I doubt they existed. Rebecca's phone buzzed, another call about the Brookline property. She stared at it for a long moment before declining the call. I need to be with my children, she said firmly. Everything else can wait. As if on cue, Amy appeared at the top of the stairs, supported by the female officer. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were clear. The documentation was complete. The truth was out. Lucas ran to his sister, wrapping his arms around her waist. She held him close, her chin resting on his head. You saved us, she whispered. You were so brave. We saved each other, he corrected. Outside, more police cars arrived. Neighbors gathered despite the late hour, forming a protective circle of witness and support. The quiet house had found its voice at last. Detective Martinez cleared her throat. Mrs. Mitchell will need formal statements from all of you, but it can wait until morning. Right now, is there somewhere you can stay? Somewhere safe? Mrs. Parker stepped forward. They're staying with me. I have plenty of room, and they shouldn't be alone tonight. As they gathered essentials for the night, Lucas looked back at their house, at the closet door hanging off its hinges, at the shattered phone that had captured the truth, at the diary that had documented their fear. The truth had emerged, finally, irrevocably. But as they walked through the snow to Mrs. Parker's warm house, Lucas realized that some truths didn't need words. They lived in the way Amy squeezed his hand, in the fierce protectiveness in their mother's eyes, in the knowledge that silence, once broken, could never imprison them again. The quiet house stood empty behind them, its secrets finally spoken, its shadows giving way to the flashing lights of justice. The safe house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in neighboring Millbrook, its unremarkable exterior belying its purpose. Lucas stood at the window of the small bedroom he now shared with Amy, watching snowplows clear the streets in the pale morning light. 3 days had passed since the night everything changed. 3 days of police interviews, medical examinations, and endless questions. 3 days and Michael was still free. Hey, kiddo. Amy's voice came from the doorway. She looked different in the oversized police athletic league sweatshirt. Detective Martinez had brought her younger somehow, but stronger too. Mom made pancakes. Lucas turned from the window. Real ones or frozen? Real ones. Mrs. Parker taught her last night. Amy attempted a smile. They're only a little burned. In the small kitchen downstairs, Rebecca stood at the stove, determination written across her face as she flipped another slightly charred pancake. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. None of them had been sleeping well. The Brookline deal fell through, she announced without preamble, sliding pancakes onto their plates. Clients saw the news coverage. They're going with another agent. Mom, I'm so sorry. Amy began, but Rebecca cut her off. No, don't you dare apologize. Not for this. Not for any of it. She gripped the spatula tightly. I'm the one who's sorry. I'm the one who brought him into our lives, who didn't see what was happening right in front of me. Mrs. Mitchell? Officer Chun appeared in the kitchen doorway, his young face serious. Detective Martinez is here. They have an update. Lucas felt his stomach clench as the detective entered. She looked tired, but there was something in her expression, a contained energy that made him sit up straighter. We found his other identity, she said without preamble. Michael Blackwood was born Michael Barrett. He has a history of similar behavior in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Different names, different families, same pattern. Rebecca sank into a chair. Other families? Other children. 3 previous marriages, all to successful professional women with children. Detective Martinez pulled out her tablet. In each case, he isolated the family, established strict rules, used psychological manipulation and physical confinement as punishment. What happened to them? Amy's voice was barely a whisper. They got away. All of them. But none of them had the evidence you collected, Lucas. The detective smiled slightly. Your diary and that video? They're going to make sure he can't do this to anyone else. A knock at the front door made them all jump. Officer Chun checked the security camera before relaxing. It's the victim advocate and... He hesitated. A news crew. No. Rebecca's voice was firm. No interviews. No cameras. My children have been through enough. Mom. Lucas spoke up. Maybe we should. So other kids know they can tell someone. So other families know they can get away. Amy reached for his hand under the table. Lucas is right. We kept quiet for so long. Maybe it's time to be loud. Detective Martinez nodded approvingly. You don't have to show your faces. No names need to be used. But your story could help others recognize the signs. Rebecca looked at her children. Really looked at them. Seeing not victims but survivors. Okay, she said finally. But we do it together. And we do it on our terms. The interview took place in the safe house living room. The camera focused on hands. Lucas's small fingers turning the pages of his diary. Amy's hands gripping a cup of tea. Rebecca's hands clasped tightly in her lap as she described the gradual way control had been established over their lives. He was so careful at first, Rebecca's voice explained over the footage. Every rule seemed reasonable. Every restriction appeared protective. By the time I realized something was wrong, he had built walls around us that seemed impossible to break. But walls can break, Amy added, her face off camera but her voice strong. Silence can break. You just need someone brave enough to speak. Or write, Lucas whispered, sharing a small smile with his sister. As the news crew packed up their equipment, Detective Martinez's phone buzzed. She checked it, her expression shifting to one of intense focus. They found him, she announced, trying to cross into Canada with fake documents. Border Patrol recognized him from the alerts. The room erupted in a chaos of emotion. Rebecca crying, Amy laughing through tears, Officer Chun calling for backup. But Lucas just stood there, feeling something heavy lift from his chest. He can't hurt anyone else now, he said simply. Detective Martinez crouched down to his level. No, he can't. And you know why? Because you chose to be brave. Because you understood that sometimes the scariest thing you can do is tell the truth. That night, in their shared room, Amy sat on the edge of Lucas's bed. What do you think happens now? Lucas thought about it. We get better. We get stronger. We help other people get away from their quiet houses. Amy pulled him into a fierce hug. When did my little brother get so wise? Probably around the time my big sister got so brave. Outside their window, snow continued to fall on the safe house at the end of the quiet cul-de-sac. But inside, the silence had been replaced by something stronger. The sound of healing, of truth, of a family finding its voice again. And somewhere in the night, a police transport carried Michael Barrett to a place where his own walls would finally close in around him, leaving him alone with the echoes of all the silences he had tried to enforce. The quiet house on Maple Grove Drive stood empty now, its secrets exposed, its power broken. But its lesson remained. Sometimes the bravest thing a family can do is break the silence. Even if they have to break themselves a little to do it. They would heal. They would rebuild. They would learn to trust again. But they would never, ever be quiet about the truth again. The courthouse corridor felt endless, its marble floors reflecting the winter sunlight that streamed through tall windows. Lucas sat on a wooden bench, his feet barely touching the ground, watching people hurry past in suits and uniforms. Next to him, Amy twisted a tissue in her hands, reducing it to shreds. The grand jury will hear your testimony separately, Detective Martinez explained, crouching down to their eye level. She'd traded her usual blazer for a formal suit, her badge gleaming at her hip. But first, there's something you both need to see. She opened a thick file folder, pulling out a series of photographs. Lucas recognized Michael immediately, though he looked different in each image. Darker hair, lighter hair, different names on business cards and wedding announcements. Michael Barrett, James Blackwood, David Morrison, Thomas Wright. Martinez laid each photo down carefully. For identities we've confirmed. For families he infiltrated. Amy's hand found Lucas's, squeezing tight. What happened to them? They're here. Martinez nodded toward a nearby conference room. And they want to meet you. Lucas felt his heart skip. All of them. The ones who could make it. 3 families. 6 children. The detective's eyes softened. You're not alone anymore. The conference room door opened with a soft click. Inside, Lucas saw faces that seemed to mirror his own experience. Children who had grown up too fast. Mothers who carried the same guilt in their eyes that he saw in Rebecca's. A girl about Amy's age stepped forward first. I'm Sophie Morrison. Well, that was his name when he married my mom. Her voice cracked slightly. He locked me in a basement storage room. Closet under the stairs. Amy whispered back. Attic, said a boy who couldn't have been more than 10. I'm Daniel. He made my mom think I was lying about everything. One by one, they shared their stories. Different houses, different cities, but the same patterns. The same rules. The same threats. The same silence. Rebecca stood in the doorway, watching as her children found their place in this unexpected community of survivors. Lucas saw tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of fierce pride. Tell them about the diary, Sophie's mother urged gently. Tell them what you did. Lucas pulled his Pokemon binder from his backpack. The diary inside was no longer his private record. It was evidence now, each page carefully photocopied and labeled by the prosecution team. I wrote everything down, he explained. Every rule, every punishment, every time he threatened us. He looked around the room. Did any of you try to tell? Daniel nodded. I told my teacher once, but he was so good at explaining things away, making it sound like I was confused or making things up. He had everyone fooled, Sophie added. Perfect businessman, perfect stepfather, perfect lie. Not perfect enough, Amy said quietly. Not anymore. Detective Martinez cleared her throat. The grand jury needs to understand his pattern. Your testimonies, especially Lucas's documentation, will show that this wasn't a one-time situation. It was a calculated, repeated behavior. Will we have to see him? Lucas asked, his voice small. No, sweetheart. Sophie's mother moved to kneel beside him. That's what we're here for, all of us together. Our stories make his defense impossible. He can't claim it was a misunderstanding when there are 4 families telling the same truth. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the district attorney, a tall woman with kind eyes and a determined set to her jaw. It's time for the first testimony. Who wants to go first? To everyone's surprise, it was Daniel who stood up. I will, he said. I'm not scared anymore. One by one, they took their turns before the grand jury. Lucas went last, clutching his diary like a shield. But when he began to read from its pages, his voice grew stronger. The words he'd written in secret now rang out in the formal chamber, breaking through years of enforced silence. When it was over, they gathered again in the conference room. Detective Martinez entered with a rare smile. The grand jury took less than an hour. Full indictment on all charges. Multiple counts, multiple jurisdictions. The room erupted in tears and hugs. Lucas found himself wrapped in Sophie's arms, then Daniel's, then passed among all the survivors who understood exactly what today meant. Hey, Amy whispered, pulling him aside. Look what Sophie gave me. She held out a small key ring. It's from their house, the basement key. She said we should all destroy the keys that kept us locked up. Lucas thought about the padlock from their closet, now sitting in an evidence bag. Maybe we could melt them down, he suggested. Make something new, something good. Like what? Like medals, for being brave, for telling the truth, for helping catch him. Amy's eyes filled with tears. That's perfect. Outside the courthouse, snow was falling again. The survivors gathered on the steps, a photographer from the DA's office capturing the moment. No faces would be shown in the papers, but their presence would be felt, a united front against the shadows of their past. What happens now? Lucas asked Detective Martinez as they headed to their cars. Now? She smiled. Now you heal. You grow. You remember that strength isn't about being quiet. It's about knowing when to speak up. In the parking lot, Rebecca gathered her children close. I think it's time we found our own place, she said. A new house. A fresh start. With no closets, Lucas added firmly. With no closets, Rebecca agreed. They drove back to the safe house through the falling snow. But Lucas didn't feel safe because of the walls around them. He felt safe because of the truth between them, because of the other survivors who shared their story, because sometimes the best way to fight shadows is to step into the light. And somewhere in a cell, Michael Barrett faced his own kind of silence. But this time, he was the one locked away. This time, the truth had won. The house on Birch Lake Road looked nothing like their old home. Single-story, modern, with large windows that let in streams of natural light. Most importantly, it had been designed with an open floor plan. No hidden spaces. No dark corners. No closets under stairs. Lucas stood in what would be his new bedroom, watching the moving crew unload boxes from their truck. None of their old furniture had made the journey. Rebecca had insisted on a complete fresh start, down to the last detail. Hey there. Amy appeared in his doorway, carrying a box labeled Lucas Important Stuff in her careful handwriting. Where do you want your Pokemon collection? The question wasn't really about Pokemon, and they both knew it. Each item they unpacked carried the weight of choice now. What to keep from their old life, what to leave behind. By the window, Lucas decided, where I can see it all the time. Amy set the box down and started helping him arrange his cards and figures on the new shelf system. Did you read Sophie's email? Lucas nodded. After the grand jury indictment, the survivors had created a private group chat. Sophie Morrison had emerged as a sort of big sister to all of them, especially the younger ones. She's starting a support group, Amy continued, for kids who've been through stuff like us. She wants us to help. What kind of help? Just being there, showing them they're not alone. Amy paused, holding a Pikachu figure. Showing them it gets better. A knock at the front door made them both tense, a reflex they were working on with their therapist. But it was just Mrs. Parker, carrying a houseplant and a casserole. I know you're not officially moved in yet, she called out. But I couldn't wait to bring over your housewarming gifts. Rebecca emerged from the master bedroom, paint swatches in hand. She looked different these days, stronger, more present. The successful real estate agent was still there, but now she carried herself with a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with property values. Sarah, you didn't have to, she began, but Mrs. Parker waved her off. Of course I did. That's what neighbors do. Real neighbors, not the kind who look away. Lucas watched as the women hugged. Mrs. Parker had sold her house on Maple Grove Drive and bought one 3 doors down from them. To keep an eye on my favorite family, she'd explained. The afternoon passed in a blur of unpacking and arranging. Lucas's new room took shape around him, bright colors, open spaces, and a desk positioned so he could see both his door and his window. No surprises, no hidden angles. Lucas, Rebecca called up from the kitchen. Detective Martinez is here. He found the detective in their sunny new kitchen, looking surprisingly casual in jeans and a sweater. She had become a regular presence in their lives, checking in weekly even after the case was handed over to the prosecutors. Thought you might want to see this, she said, pulling out her tablet. The story you helped us break is having an impact. The screen showed a news article, National Hotline Report Surge in Calls After Barrett Case Coverage. Below that, another headline, Schools Implement New Training to Spot Signs of Family Abuse. Your diary, Martinez explained, is being used to train police officers, to show them what to look for, what questions to ask. Lucas felt Amy's hand on his shoulder. Really? Really? Martinez smiled. You didn't just help catch one abuser. You're helping prevent others from doing the same thing. Rebecca joined them, wiping paint from her hands. Speaking of helping, I've been thinking about a career change. They all turned to look at her. I'm good at real estate, she continued. Good at reading people, good at understanding what they need. But maybe those skills could be better used helping families in crisis find safe places to start over. Like a safe house finder? Lucas asked. Something like that. Rebecca smiled. There are organizations that help survivors relocate, start fresh. They need people who understand both property and privacy. Mom, that's perfect, Amy breathed. A timer dinged. Mrs. Parker's casserole was ready. As they gathered around their new kitchen island, no formal dining room, no rigid seating arrangements, Lucas looked at his family. They were different now, changed by what they'd been through. But maybe he thought they were stronger for it. I have something to show you, he said suddenly, running to get his backpack. He returned with a new notebook, bright blue, with a silver lock that only worked from the inside. I started writing again. Oh, Lucas, Rebecca began, concern crossing her face. Not like before, he assured her quickly. Not about bad things, about getting better, about helping others, about. He opened to the first page, about moving forward. Amy leaned over to read the first line. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is start over. That's beautiful, Mrs. Parker said softly. Detective Martinez raised her water glass. To starting over. To moving forward, Amy added. To being loud, Lucas finished. They clinked glasses over Mrs. Parker's casserole, in their bright new kitchen, in their house full of light. Outside, spring was coming, melting away the last traces of winter. Inside, a family continued to heal, one page, one day, one truth at a time. The house on Birch Lake Road would never be a quiet house. And that, Lucas knew, was exactly how a home should be. April brought cherry blossoms to the steps of Suffolk County Superior Court. Lucas watched the pale pink petals drift across the marble stairs, remembering how different everything had felt during the grand jury testimony 3 months ago. That day had been about discovery, finding other survivors, sharing their stories for the first time. Today was about justice. Different this time, isn't it? Sophie Morrison squeezed his hand. Since their first meeting at the grand jury, the survivors had become like extended family. Weekly video calls, group therapy sessions, and a shared determination to see Michael Barrett face justice had forged bonds stronger than fear. Less scary, Lucas agreed, clutching his new journal. The one filled with healing, not horror. The courtroom was packed. After the grand jury indictment made headlines, Michael Barrett's pattern of abuse had become national news. Other potential victims had come forward, though only the 4 families had enough evidence for criminal charges. Detective Martinez found them outside the courtroom. Ready for round 2? Amy nodded, her hand finding Lucas's. We did the hard part already. Today we just have to confirm what we already told the grand jury. And watch him face the consequences, Rebecca added, her voice firm. District Attorney Eleanor Hayes approached their group, her expression confident. The grand jury testimony was compelling, but today is different. Today we show the world not just what he did, but who you've become because of it. Not victims, survivors. The evidence was overwhelming. After the grand jury indictment, more of Michael's past had unraveled. Financial fraud across 5 states, multiple aliases, a pattern of targeting successful professional women with children, spanning over a decade. When Lucas took the stand, he didn't need to recount every detail. The grand jury testimony had done that. Instead, DA Hayes asked him about healing. You kept 2 journals, she said. Tell us about them. Lucas held up both notebooks. This one, he indicated his old Pokemon binder, was for surviving, for remembering the truth when Michael tried to make us doubt ourselves. He lifted the new one. This one is for healing, for helping other kids know they can get away too. Michael's defense attorney tried to undermine their testimony, but the groundwork laid during the grand jury held firm. For families, same patterns, same rules, same abuse. The defendant would have you believe these children imagined identical stories. D.A. Hayes told the jury in her closing argument that 4 families independently created the same detailed allegations. That Lucas Mitchell, at 8 years old, somehow fabricated a diary that perfectly matches abuse patterns documented by experts. The truth is simpler. Michael Barrett is a predator, and these brave survivors have finally stopped him. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours. On all counts as presented in the indictment, the foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty." Judge Sullivan's sentence was comprehensive. 60 years without parole, consecutive sentences for each family's charges. "The systematic nature of your abuse," the judge declared, "the calculated way you targeted these families, and your complete lack of remorse leave me no choice but to impose the maximum sentence." Outside the courthouse, the survivors gathered one last time. No cameras, they'd maintained their privacy throughout. But they had each other, and they had their truth. Sophie hugged Lucas tightly. "You started this, brave one. Your diary gave us all a voice." "We did it together," Lucas corrected. Looking at his extended family of survivors, Rebecca gathered her children close. "Ready to go home?" Lucas looked up at the cherry blossoms, then at Michael being led away to serve his sentence. "Yes," he said. "We're free now." They left the courthouse not as victims giving testimony, but as survivors who had reclaimed their story. The quiet house on Maple Grove Drive was just a memory. Their voices, once silenced, would never be quiet again. And somewhere, Lucas hoped, other children in other quiet houses would hear their story and find the courage to speak their own truth. Because silence, they had proved, was no match for survival. The community center buzzed with quiet energy as Lucas helped Sophie arrange chairs in a circle. 6 months after the trial, their survivor support group had grown from the original 4 families to include others who had found the courage to speak up. "Signs are up," Amy called from the hallway, where she'd posted directions to Safe Space Youth Meeting, all welcome. At 16 now, she'd taken on a leadership role alongside Sophie, particularly focused on helping teenage survivors. "Thanks, co-captain," Sophie grinned, adjusting the last chair. "Lucas, want to set up the art supplies?" Lucas nodded, pulling out sketchbooks and colored pencils. Art therapy had become a crucial part of their healing process, especially for the younger kids who struggled to find words for their experiences. He was arranging markers by color when Daniel arrived with his mother. The boy who had been so hesitant to speak at the grand jury now moved with quiet confidence, immediately helping Lucas with the supplies. "I brought my new comic," Daniel whispered. "The one about the superhero who can detect lies." "Perfect," Lucas smiled. Daniel's drawings had become a favorite among the group's younger members. His superhero, Truth Seeker, fought villains who used manipulation and secrets as weapons. Rebecca arrived with snacks and Dr. Sarah Chun, their group therapist. Over the months, his mother had found her own way of healing, not just through her new work with survivor relocation services, but by helping create safe spaces like this. "Quick check-in before everyone arrives?" Dr. Chun suggested, gathering the core group members. They stood in a small circle, a ritual they'd developed. Each person shared one victory, no matter how small, from the past week. "I slept through the night," Daniel offered. "No nightmares." "I gave a speech at school," Sophie said, "about recognizing abuse patterns." "I showed a house without checking the security cameras first," Rebecca added softly. "I left my bedroom door closed," Amy shared, "and felt safe doing it." Lucas took a deep breath. "I finished my new journal, the whole thing, and started another one." Dr. Chun beamed at them. "Beautiful progress, everyone. Remember, healing isn't linear. Some days are harder than others, and that's okay." The room began filling with other survivors and their families. Lucas recognized some from the trial's media coverage, others from local support services. Each had their own story, their own quiet house they'd escaped. Welcome, everyone. Sophie began once the circle was full. Today we're talking about rebuilding trust. But first, we have something special to share. Amy stood holding a small box. When we first started this group, we talked about what to do with the keys from our locked spaces. Today, we finally decided. She opened the box, revealing a collection of keys from closets, basements, attics, places that had once been prisons. Rebecca stepped forward with a small velvet bag. We had them melted down, she explained, reaching into the bag, and remade into these. She held up a simple pendant, a small key transformed into a symbol of freedom, inscribed with a single word, survivor. Everyone here has their own key to the past, Sophie continued. If you want, we can transform it into something new, something that reminds you of your strength, not your pain. One by one, survivors approached with their keys. Some cried, others stood tall. Each key represented a prison escaped, a silence broken. During the art therapy session that followed, Lucas worked on a new drawing. Not of the closet this time, but of an open door. Light streamed through it, touching everything with gold. That's beautiful, Daniel said, peering over his shoulder. Can I put it in my next comic? Sure, Lucas smiled. What's Truth Seeker fighting this time? The Shadow Keeper, Daniel replied. Someone who tries to keep kids in the dark. But they learn to glow so bright the shadows can't hide them anymore. Amy joined them, her own sketch showing a bird breaking free from a cage. Kind of like us, right? Lucas nodded, adding final touches to his drawing. Exactly like us. As the session wound down, Dr. Chun gathered them for a final sharing circle. Remember, she said, healing happens in community, in speaking our truth, in helping others find their voice. Lucas looked around the circle at all the survivors, young and old, each carrying their transformed key, each finding their way from darkness to light. He touched his own pendant, thinking of his first diary, hidden in that Pokemon binder so long ago. Sometimes, he said quietly, the bravest thing isn't escaping, it's helping others find their way out too. Rebecca wrapped an arm around him, and Amy took his hand. Together, they had broken their silence. Together, they would help others break free. And in that community center, surrounded by survivors becoming heroes, Lucas knew they would never be truly quiet again. 1 year to the day after Michael Barrett's sentencing, Lucas sat on the back deck of their Birch Lake Road home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. His newest journal lay open in his lap, its pages filled with hope instead of fear. Hot chocolate delivery, Amy called, stepping through the sliding glass doors with 2 steaming mugs. At 16, she'd grown into herself, confident, strong, unafraid to take up space in the world. Her debate team medals hung proudly in her room, alongside her survivor's pendant. Thanks, Lucas smiled, accepting the mug decorated with Pokemon characters, a birthday gift from Sophie, who was now away at college but still made time for their weekly video calls. Writing about today? Amy settled beside him on the deck swing. Lucas nodded, showing her the page. 1 year since the darkness ended, since we all stood together and watched justice happen. Sometimes I think about the quiet house, but not in the same way. Now I think about how we broke the silence, how we turned our story into hope for others. Amy squeezed his shoulder. Pretty wise for a 9-year-old. Almost 10, he corrected, grinning. Inside, they could hear Rebecca on the phone, her voice carrying through the open windows as she coordinated with the Safe House Network. She'd found her calling, using her real estate expertise to help other survivors start fresh. The Brookline estate was a distant memory now, replaced by something far more meaningful. Mrs. Parker's voice drifted over from next door, where she was watering her garden. She waved when she saw them, and they waved back, a normal, neighborly interaction unburdened by secrets. Oh, Amy sat up suddenly. Did you check your email? Daniel sent the finished comic book. Lucas pulled up the PDF on his tablet. Truth Seeker and the League of Light filled the screen, dedicated to my first friend who showed me how to be brave. The doorbell rang, and neither of them flinched at the sound. Another small victory. That'll be Detective Martinez, Amy said, standing. Mom invited her for dinner to celebrate. The detective Laura, as she'd asked them to call her now, had become family over the past year. She'd even started volunteering at their support group, helping other law enforcement officers understand the subtle signs they'd missed before. Something smells amazing, Laura said as they welcomed her in. She carried a gift bag that clinked slightly. A little celebration present. Inside the bag were 3 small frames. In each one, pressed cherry blossoms from the courthouse steps, preserved between glass. Beneath them, a simple inscription, "Freedom blooms." Rebecca joined them, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Perfect timing. Dinner's ready. They gathered around the kitchen island, no formal dining room, no assigned seats, no rigid rules. Just family and friends sharing a meal, sharing their lives. "I have news," Laura announced over dessert. The Barrett case study is now part of standard training for law enforcement across the country. Lucas's diary method has been adapted into a detection protocol. Lucas felt warmth spread through his chest, different from fear or shame. Pride, he realized. Pride in turning their pain into protection for others. And, Laura continued, Sophie's college advocacy group just got approved for national chapter status. The Quiet No More Network will be launching on campuses next semester. Amy beamed. She told me they're using my art therapy techniques in their workshops. We all found our ways to help, didn't we? Rebecca mused. Different paths, same destination. After dinner, they gathered on the back deck to watch the stars emerge. The motion sensor lights came on automatically, no more darkness, no more shadows. "Read us something?" Amy requested, nodding at Lucas's journal. He opened to the last page, where he'd written his thoughts about the year ahead. "Sometimes people ask if I'm sad about what happened to us, but that's not the right question. The right question is, what did we do with what happened? We turned our pain into power, our silence into strength, our fear into freedom. The Quiet House taught us that silence can be dangerous, but it also taught us that voices, once freed, can change the world. We're not just survivors anymore. We're guides, showing others the way out of their own quiet houses. Today, I watched the sunset and didn't feel afraid of the dark. Because now I know, light always returns. Truth always finds its voice. And freedom, once found, spreads like wildfire. We are the light returners, the silence breakers, the hope makers, and our story is still being written." As if in response, a chorus of crickets began their evening song. A year ago, such sounds might have made them nervous. Now they were just part of life's natural music, neither quiet nor loud, just free. Rebecca raised her glass. "To the light returners, to the silence breakers," Amy added. "To the hope makers," Laura echoed. Lucas closed his journal, feeling the weight of its pages. Not burden now, but possibility. To stories still being written. The Quiet House on Maple Grove Drive was just a memory now. But here, in their home filled with light and life and love, they had written a new story, one that would echo through time, helping others find their way from darkness to dawn. And in the gentle night, surrounded by family and friends, their voices joined the symphony of freedom, never again to be silenced, never again to be afraid.